मानुषी संवाद में आप सबका स्वागत है। वेलकम टू द 5th अक्टूबर 2022 एडिशन ऑफ मानुषी संवाद। सबसे पहले तो आप सबको विजयदशमी दशहरा की शुभकामनाएं। और सुबह से उत्साह का मूड देश में बना हुआ है। मुझे लगता है वो उत्साह भी ठीक है, परंतु ये भी याद रखना चाहिए, यदि हम जगे नहीं, यदि हम उठ खड़े नहीं हुए, तो अगले 10-20 साल में दशहरा दिवाली मनाना दिल्ली जैसे स्थानों में भी शायद दुर्लभ हो जाए, जो माहौल देश का बनता जा रहा है। खैर, वो बातों की चर्चा तो हर रोज होती है, उस किस्म की बातों की। आज जरा अलग किस्म का टॉपिक है, जो कि ओवरऑल ग्लोबल जो कॉन्टेक्स्ट में एक आइडियोलॉजिकल वॉरफेयर चल रहा है, विशेषकर केवल हिंदू समाज के ऊपर नहीं पर दुनिया भर में, ये है वोकिज्म का। ये वोकिज्म शब्द हाल ही के वर्षों में करेंसी में आया है, तो पुराना, बहुत पुराना भी नहीं खैर, पर अभी हाल ही के वर्षों में इसका इस्तेमाल होना शुरू हुआ। इससे पहले लोग, जो आज जिनको वो कहा जा रहा है, उनको लिबटार्ड कहते थे, क्योंकि वो अपने आप को लिबरल कहते हैं, परंतु होते नहीं हैं लिबरल। मैं तो मानती हूँ कि इनका लिबरलिज्म का क्लेम सबसे ज़्यादा खौफनाक है और सबसे ज़्यादा फरेबी है। खैर, इन सब सवालों पर चर्चा करने के लिए ये जो वोकिज्म है, मुखौटा पहनती है बड़े खुले दिमाग के विचारों का, मुखौटा पहनती है लिबरलिज्म का, मुखौटा पहनती है व्यक्तिवाद का, इंडिविजुअलिज्म का, परंतु इसके पीछे बहुत ही जेनोसाइडल आइडियोलॉजी छुपी हुई है। तो इसी पर चर्चा करने के लिए आज हमारे साथ कॉर्पेंटियर जुड़ रहे हैं, वेल नोन जर्नलिस्ट हैं। वेलकम कॉम।
नमस्कार।
नमस्ते। नमस्ते। So कॉम, I won't waste any further time, but get you started with explaining why is it that suddenly this term wokism has become popular. I don't remember hearing it 5 years ago, not in India anyway. It seems to have gained currency only in the last 2-3 years. What is it that brought this particular term into currency, and what exactly do you mean by it? I mean, the dictionary definition defines it in certain ways. What exactly do you mean by wokism? Because this is a topic you chose. So I want you to explain to our viewers. Ji.
As you know, Madhuji, when you ask me to talk about Wokism, and in particular its manifestation in the campaign and promotion of what is now known as LGBTQX causes, I told you that I wanted to expand the topic because I believe it would not be fully understandable if it was not given the wider context. And
Yes.
Wokism is a form of extreme liberalism in the meaning that is given to the term liberalism nowadays, particularly in the US. Liberalism meant something very different in Europe and in India as well. But when the US equated it with a form of social far leftism, it became a form of cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism adapted to the culture and technology of our age. As you know, when Marx lived, Marxism used the technologies of the time as its battle horses, the steam engine, the modern war technologies, big factories, the working class. Nowadays, Marxism has mutated into what you might call the soft power of software. And therefore, it's no longer about the working class and heavy industry. It's about the internet, about apps, about the new technologies, and about unlimited human freedom, wantonness, in which the only law is basically human desire expressed individually according to everybody's mood. So as a result, Wokism is seen as an awakening from the darkness of the past, in which people thought that there was some sort of a law of nature and that you had to conform to it broadly for your own good and for the good of society. And now all that is seen as oppression, patriarchy, everything you hear about all the time. And it has to be replaced by this so-called freedom, which of course does not extend to the economic sphere, because the economic sphere is still tightly regulated, and there are the haves and the have-nots. And the very, very rich are obviously, by the very nature of the system, above the law. But all those who belong to the average population are supposed to embrace, or if they don't embrace, to be submitted to the new rules which are being dictated by the so-called woke elite, which is usually self-proclaimed, but which gets a tremendous amount of publicity and support from the big financial and political powers. So you can call Wokism a sort of a new religion of human absolutism. There is nothing about human desires, and humans themselves are not to remain human. They are going towards transhumanism, which means a sort of a not so well-defined post-human stage. And therefore, the laws of nature have no meaning in that light, because if you are a man and want to be a woman, then you can. If you want to have a child, technology can do that for you. Maybe not now yet, but soon. And all people from childhood are given the opportunity, supposedly, of choosing their gender. And gender is sometimes equated with sex, but it's supposed to be different from sex, because eventually being a man or a woman is not a matter of biology anymore, it's a matter of how you feel. And if one day you feel as a woman that you are a man, then you are a man. And that has been explained by many, and of course it has been confronted by people who said, well, if being a woman is only a matter of feeling, then what is a woman? And naturally the wokes could not explain it. They said a woman is a woman. And in fact, she's not even a woman, because there is no difference between men and women, and they can be both or either. And then, of course, you have all the variety that is being offered to you, LGBTX, transgender. Children are now being taught in school that they can choose their sex, and would they want to have sex with a girl or with a boy. And believe it or not, in many schools in the West, that begins at the age of 6. And of course, you are told that this is in the name of freedom. And if parents oppose it, then that means parents are basically fascist, and they are not acknowledging the freedom of the children to choose the way they want to live.
Firstly, I have a problem with allowing them to define themselves as liberals of whatever vintage, because the basic meaning of liberal is that you let people be. I do what I think best, but I allow you to think your way and live the life that you think is better for you. That's baseline for liberalism. To my mind, Wokism represents uh, a very extreme narcissistic form of individualism, which is not even being defined by the concerned individual, but actually uh, controlled as though by some hidden hand, what as an individual you should think and express. Like you said, at 6 years, you are told you can choose to be a boy or a girl and go for sex change. One of the sickliest manifestation of wokeism is the rampant sex change operations that are taking place, where even children are being encouraged to go for it. Now, this kind of tampering with the bodies of others, it's not that, if you do it yourself, that's okay. But you are pushing others to follow a certain path, especially little kids, then it can't be called liberalism.
No, because liberalism still has to accept certain constraints, which are the constraints of reality. But in the case of Wokism, as we have just said, reality is considered adjustable through science and technology. And furthermore, the whole underlying theory is that by nature, you are either an oppressor or an oppressed person. Therefore, even if you don't know it, you should break out of oppression, and at the same time, you should stop being an oppressor. So that means you are, by definition, guilty. And as you know, in many countries now, people from various professions, corporate employees, are being called into seminars where they are told, you don't know it, but you are actually oppressors. And in order to change that, number one, you should agree to listen and spend a lot of time with LGBT people who will explain to you their problems. And you should also include them in your companies, in your board of directors, in your teams, anything you do, whether it's sports, culture, industry, you should have representation from those minorities which have been exploited and excluded. So now, in the name of inclusiveness, you must have members of the various communities, ethnic, but also sexual. And for example, you should have somebody who is a transsexual, but who loves men, and somebody else is a transsexual from a man to a woman, but she loves women. So, all these things are supposed to be part of the menu, as it were. And if you have any resistance to that, then you really need to go through some sort of retraining and re-education. So it's very Marxistic in that sense. I mean, because basically it tells you you are part of a very corrupt and very wrong system, and you must learn the truth. In the past, it used to be done by teaching Marxism, Leninism, and in re-education camps. Now, in re-education camps are used to teach you Wokism and the real truth about life and about how to correct all the mistakes of the thousands of years past, including all civilizations which have produced these terrible mistakes that we call religions, which were patriarchal. I mean, you have that famous statement from one of the gurus of Wokism, Yuval Hariri, who has become the darling of the Davos center, the Davos series of conferences. And Yuval Hariri said, all this religion business about God is fake news, because we know that basically man is God. He can become God, and gods were fabricated when man couldn't get there because he didn't have the technology. But now man can do whatever gods did in the past, so who needs religions and gods?
Com, my question to you is this. Who are the originators? Like, for example, we know Marxism, who originated it, and then who carried forward. There's specific persons who can be identified, from Marx to Lenin to Stalin to Castro to Mao to, there's a whole chain that carries this ideology forward, or whichever way you want to call it. What about this Wokism? Who are the, and especially LGTBism, or whatever ism they call themselves or identify themselves with? What are the powers behind it, and why should Davos have particular interest in being led by the nose by this group?
There is a long succession of thinkers, and it's probably not possible to give the fatherhood of the movement to one or two or three persons. It developed over a period of time, and you can point to the early feminists in a way. You can also point to the early so-called gay activists, gay rights activists. And then you find that even further back, you have the Frankfurt School of Sociology and Philosophy in Germany. The Frankfurt School was made of a few people who became quite famous. They were expelled from Germany or fled when the Nazis came to power, and they moved to America, where they became, a sort of a very influential group among the center-left Americans, even the center-left or left-of-center capitalists, who found them very interesting and intriguing. And those people thought that they should destroy society because it was wrong. And it was wrong at the very basis of the family and the way in which people behave with each other. And they felt that eventually a new world would take over, which would be truly, they were cultural Marxists originally. So they thought this new world would be truly Marxist, egalitarian, socialistic, but it would be so not only in economic terms, although the economy was not their main concern, but it would be so in terms of human relations. And that essentially entailed breaking up the traditional family structure, which they regarded as feudal, patriarchal, and oppressive of women and children.
That doesn't fit in well with their deep engagement and love for Islam. Most folks are very pro-Islam, and they are in fact battering everybody using the myth of minoritism that they have foisted onto Islamists, because Islam is a global corporation, second largest population in the world. By no stretch of imagination can Muslims be called a minority or a global minority. In most countries, also, wherever they have a foothold, they're fast expanding to acquire levers of power and very rapidly move towards being a very tyrannical majority. Now, what explains their love for Islam?
I think it is the traditional revolutionary dialectic that if you can muster the support of minorities, remember the Woks are dealing mostly with Islamic communities in the West because they are primarily active in Western societies. Of course, when they are active in a country like India, then they will also there look for the support of minorities. And they will promote LGBTQX, they will promote Dalits, they will promote people whom they see more as instruments than real targets of their beneficence. They are really saying these people will help us in one way or another because they will be interested, like we are, in breaking the control of the majority. So that has been their policy, their tactics, in fact, their strategy, both in Europe and in America, where they systematically go against what they regard as the evil ruling majority. Therefore, it's a deeply subversive thing. There is this traditional way of seeing that, for example, the Jews were oppressed, persecuted under Nazism. Therefore, the Jews, and even before Nazism and a number of mainly Western societies, therefore, Jews are among the minority who are victims, even though they are generally extremely well-to-do, extremely well-educated, and extremely well-influential. But still, that minority label somehow is tagged to anybody, whether they are a color minority, a religious minority, or a sexual minority. And the whole idea is to create this confederation of minorities to upset and overthrow a majority. Now, remember, that's not so different than what Lenin did in Russia when he started the Bolshevik Revolution, which in fact was more of a coup, because he brought most of the minorities with him, the Jews, the Armenians, quite a few homosexuals, along with what was considered to be the lumpen majority, which is the workers, the poor. But the workers, the poor by themselves, were not that attractive to him. He needed the minorities, the ethnic minorities. And the same is true of the Woks. They do want a lot of support from the ethnic minorities, and they are not that interested in the suffering majorities.
Islam is not a minority religion. That's the point I'm making.
But in the West,
and it does not allow for individual expression. If anything, it's the most anti-individual ideology the world has ever known. It allows.
Well, that is true. Sorry, I got your point. But remember, in the West, you are dealing with Muslim minorities. Therefore, they respond to that definition. And furthermore, the Woks have I'm talking about the ideologues, they have a very long-term and devious way of looking at things. They feel that by creating revolution and breaking up society, they will eventually get their way. Of course, this may be completely misled and misleading, but they also are totalitarian. They basically don't accept resistance to their creed. You have to accept it, otherwise you are basically excluded from society. That is what is happening in centers of wokeness, like many American Ivy League universities, where if you don't belong to the woke clan, you basically are a pariah, because you don't belong, you are a Trumpist, you are whatever they call you. but there is simply no room for you. And like all totalitarian creeds, they say no toleration for those who essentially, are not completely embracing our views.
It seems to me that Wokism is actually, in a way, you could say Marxism gone haywire, a sicklier form of that, because Marxism, too, as you said, believed in a minority acquiring power through means fair or foul, by decimating its opponents, um, decimating with a certain sense of pride that they're doing justice to the world, that it's a new kingdom of heaven that they're bringing about. But class struggle failed. So, therefore, they took on to other possible, then they took on women. So, they could not convince the working class that the best thing for them was to overthrow the entire economic framework, etc. Most people in the working class prefer to climb the ladder up in the bourgeois society rather than dismantle it. So they fail. It's these class struggle failure. Then, for example, in India, the left latched on to caste and now to the religious divide, because when they fail with one kind of division and the categorization of society into perpetually warring groups, then they latch on to some other. So women's rights also got pitched in a manner that every home became a center for gender war. Every workplace became a theater for gender war. It's not even justice, but war, where you're perpetually in conflict. In some ways, it's like Islam, the whole concept of Dar al Harb versus Dar al Islam. You have to establish your power. Till then, you are at war all the time. But what I'm trying to get at is that it's liberal facade, just as Marxism's facade of being an atheistic cult doesn't make sense to us in India when the Marxists aligned with Islamists to create the partition of India. It didn't make sense at all. Their atheism certainly can't be supported by Islam, and wherever Islam has come to power, they have completely decimated leftists, and they will also decimate wokists. You think they stand a chance in Iran or in Saudi Arabia or even in Pakistan?
Of course not. Remember that the last few years have seen some conflicts in Muslim countries between conservative authorities and reformers, some of whom were tempted or influenced by far left liberal ideas. They might not have been woke, although in Iran there are some of them, and of course they are in trouble. But this comes from the fact that, I heard once a young and very bright imam in Paris, and he was a leader of his community, one of the suburbs of Paris, and he was saying, I am dealing with a number of political parties, but one of them is, of course, far left, and it's voice bearer of woke ideologies, the mix of socialism and green, so-called ecological, which is mostly actually social, political, much more than it is ecological. But anyway, that's what you call the new left. And the new left is woke, and they normally have an alliance with the Muslim communities in their areas of activity. And what this Imam was saying is, of course, I completely disagree with them. I am against homosexuality, I'm against LGBT, I'm against men and women having sex outside of wedlock, all those things. But I will ally with them because they are the ones who are enabling me to increase the power of my community. And I am willing to concede to them for that. And when we are strong enough, then we won't need them. They'll have done their job. So basically, both these communities think the other one is a useful idiot, to employ Lenin's terminology. Obviously, we don't know how that will end, probably in a very bitter fight. But if I were to expand this beyond internal conflict in Western and now increasingly in Eastern societies as well, I would say that one of the unexpected effects of this, which people normally do not realize, is the Ukraine war. And that's why I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to bring it up. Because the Ukraine war seems to be just basically it's a civil war about identity and about alignments, associations or alliances. But on the other hand, it is also a global conflict between Wokism and conservatism. And the Russians under Putin have become champions of conservatism. That's why they have allied with other countries which have their own version of conservatism, like Iran, increasingly Saudi Arabia. And, well, you can name a few other countries which have gone along with them. And the reason for that is that the Russians, who have gone back to orthodoxy and, generally speaking, to religious beliefs, are convinced that this whole woke revolution, which is being imposed on them through the youth, through the performing arts, through popular culture, is deeply satanic. Putin has been saying that for years, and people in the West didn't pay attention because his speeches were mostly censored in Western media. But what he was saying was basically that these people are Satanists and they want to destroy and corrupt us. Now, in India, this might be a little puzzling because India doesn't have that Western concept of Satanism. You can call it Asuric, or you can find an equivalent in Indian philosophy and mythology. But in the West, this has a very deep meaning. And you can feel that among the intellectuals, the conservative intellectuals in Russia, and even simple average citizens, many are convinced they are fighting the devil in the form of American Wokism. Whereas on the other hand, of course, the Americans, the West, want to convince you that they are fighting evil fascist or neo-communist Russians who are not accepting freedom, democracy, individual liberty, and who are under some sort of bloodthirsty dictator who is invading peaceful Ukraine. Of course, all that is propaganda. I'm not saying that there is no propaganda on the Russian side, but the propaganda in the West is much more obvious. When you see that the Ukrainians under Zelensky, who is another woke icon, and you know why, Zelensky has been saying, we are so pro-LGBTX, we will make prostitution and pornography legal, and we even have LGBT soldiers, and we even have LGBT units fighting in our army. And look at them; they wear these, multicolored clothes. I mean, it was obviously stupid. Who cares in a war about who is LGBT and not? But the whole idea was to convince the West, you must support us because Ukraine is deeply with you. We are woke too, against the Russians who are everything against that, which of course we hate and which we should exterminate. So much so that the West has been talking quite openly for quite a few years about breaking up Russia, because you cannot let a state of that size and power challenge us. They must go with us, and if they don't go with us, we will break them up and we'll make a number of little states like Lithuania, and then they will learn from us because they'll have no choice.
Very true. I think positioning it in this form makes a lot more sense because a lot of people are seeing it only as a geopolitical war. But I do agree with you that it's also a war of ideologies. And it's not just Russia, but now, for example, the new prime minister in Italy is
Yeah.
also talking Putin's language, that
Yes.
they've come to destroy family, they've come to destroy religion, faith, culture, everything. Now, you cannot have an agenda of simple destruction without any sense of what alternative institutions are going to take care of the social order. And what I also don't understand, why the big corporates, as represented by the World Economic Forum at Davos, has put its weight in favor of wokeism and destruction of all manners of institutions. What's the connection there?
The connection is in big capital, not average rich people who can be of many opinions, but in the very super rich, super powerful elite, which we can certainly identify. I mean, it's not a conspiracy theory. There are people such as George Soros who have so much money that they can literally transform countries by simply pouring money into causes that they support. And this has become very obvious in the last 20, 30 years when you have a proliferation of multi-billionaires. Some of them will soon be trillionaires. So they are richer than the states, which by comparison are on the verge of bankruptcy quite often. And therefore, they use their wealth to promote a certain vision of the future, which can appear to them utopian, but which to most other people is dystopian, because it involves gradual suppression of all individual freedom. So here you are talking about Wokism supposedly being about freedom, and yet increasingly regulations and controls making sure that you only behave in the way that you are supposed to behave. Otherwise, you are a bad citizen, as in China, and you can be blocked from many activities and even from making a living. So this supported by the new technologies, which enable either the state or private companies which work in cahoots with the state to monitor everybody 24 hours a day and see what they buy, what they think, what they watch, what they write, and how they talk. So once you have that system in place, there is that, as I said, utopian or dystopian thought that this can be made into a society which is finally ecologically sound, which will entail drastically reducing the population by whatever means are accessible, and making sure
They
that people...
decided they only need 10%. Am I right?
Well, that's what many have said. There is probably no consensus on that, but quite a few people like Yuval Harari again have said that we don't need most people anymore, and others have said that are you going to feed all these useless eaters? Because with technology and with robotics and artificial intelligence, most of the tasks that we entrust to people, especially those who are of lower educational level, can be fulfilled by machines. Therefore, what do you do with all those people? I mean, they are obviously clogging the planet and they're creating unbearable pressure on the environment, which, by the way, is true. But that doesn't mean that you have to adopt an agenda of depopulation and decide that people have either to be reformatted into the way that you think they should be, or else there is really no room for them. Now, this all may seem like some sort of a dream concocted by people in Silicon Valley or in some other havens of wealth, but definitely the Davos Forum, which is primarily a forum about money, has been co-opted by them, and the Davos Forum has become their platform. I mean, they are openly spreading that ideology and telling people basically you don't need property anymore because you can rent whatever you need, and so on and so forth, and you can't really eat things that are too costly in terms of environmental consequences or effects. Therefore, you will soon be able to eat insects and bugs which will be produced in industry, in factories. I mean, all those things which may or may not happen, but which are certainly on the cards. And this is where you see a sort of a conjunction between people who carry different names. Some are openly wokes, others are seen as just technocrats, others are even neoconservatives, because the neoconservatives who have nothing conservative about them except the will to keep America at the top of the food chain. These people all essentially agree on this form of extreme liberalism called Wokism, and it's interesting that many of the American neoconservatives were originally Trotskyists in their youth, and then moved over to this new ideology, which is extreme high-tech imperialism. And we see a manifestation of that precisely in the war in Ukraine and in some other conflicts that have erupted in the last 20 years.
Where does China fit into all this? How does it position itself in relationship to these ideologies and the World Economic Forum's agenda of depopulation?
China is a very interesting case, as it has always been in history, because China has such a distinct civilization that although it has embraced throughout the ages a lot of ideas from other countries, Buddhism from India, and you can mention several other instances, yet when it embraced Marxism and then when it embraced capitalism in the American way, the Chinese have been trying to copy the Americans in so many things. Now they are evolving towards a more idiosyncratic, indigenous form of government and society, which is largely inspired by Confucianism, but Confucianism reviewed and corrected with Maoism, which is another form of Marxism. Although they call themselves communists, you know that they are not really applying communism in so many things. But the question about China is again that the government wants control. However, it doesn't want control from outside. It wants to control its citizens, which is again a fairly Confucian tradition. But at the same time, it wants to be free from control of anyone else because it thinks it has the greatest civilization and is now in a position to
ruin that civilization. There's nothing left of this. There's nothing left of Chinese as a civilization.
No, I would not quite agree with you. The civilization has been largely occulted and sometimes destroyed, but there is a lot of it which you can find in private Chinese society and in the way that China rules itself. I mean, we may not like it, but the fact is that there is a lot about Chinese ways of managing things, which is very deeply rooted in Chinese civilization, particularly the imperial culture.
It was never so tyrannical.
Well, it used to be. It used to be very authoritarian, except it didn't have the means that they have now. But it certainly was very authoritarian and sometimes tyrannical in the way it applied to individual people. I mean, the whole concept of the emperor being the father of the empire and every family being responsible for every one of its members, which means that if anyone commits a crime, the whole family is punished. All that is very much part of Chinese tradition. Now, Chinese civilization was not always able to keep the country together. They had several breakdowns and breakups, and the country went haywire because there were these massive revolutions. But all in all, the concept is very authoritarian. And what China is trying to do now is adapt a lot of the technologies they learned and developed from the US and from other countries and make it subservient to their own objectives. And of course, you can see that even in China, there is a split between the more internationalist, liberal, people who have been trained abroad and who feel that China could be a very prosperous leader of the global community, and the more inward-looking kind, which says, wait a minute, all those foreigners are polluting and corrupting us. We need to go back to our basic values and we need to stop this. I don't know if you have heard some speeches by Xi Jinping, who is supposed to be the leader of the more indigenous faction, who said we must stop our youth from becoming sissified by the West. We don't want sissies and ninnies corrupting our mores and being unable to fight and protect our culture. We must be strong, we must be manly, women must be womanly, and enough of this nonsense from the West, which is just meant to destroy us. So he has a pretty clear view of that.
In short, China is not letting them make entries into its own ecosystem.
At least it's trying to fight it. It's trying to fight it. I'm not saying they are doing so well on it because they are mostly using force, which is not very effective in such cases, but they are still certainly fighting back. That's a fact.
Okay, but at least they're not like the American state, which has fallen flat in the face of Wokism, it seems.
Yes, look at Biden. Biden is the ideal puppet for Wokism. Trump was trying to fight it in his own rather incoherent way.
That's right.
That's why Trump had so many followers in America and still does. I mean, Trump is still the most popular politician by far in America.
And how he's been completely banished from social media platforms. Are you saying all these platforms are now woke controlled?
Oh, yes. I mean, let's face it, the Silicon Valley was woke to begin with, or at least it became so very early on. And it set up all those companies such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, you name them. They are all run by liberal wokes who were from the beginning pining for Obama, for Biden, and who couldn't stand Trump. They were doing anything they could to not to let him come to power and then to overthrow him. And while he was there, they sabotaged constantly his initiatives, whether they were good or bad. So you had an absolute opposition to Trump simply because he wasn't coming from that school of thought, and he was thinking more like a typical 1960s American, who believes in individual freedom, but who also believes in the family, the Bill of Rights, people's Christian values. Whether or not he applied them is another matter.
Where does Narendra Modi and the BJP fit in? Where do they fit in this scheme of things? They're obviously seen as enemies by the Wokes, which is why very, very noxious attacks on BJP and Modi in particular. Though I don't know what they've done to deserve it, because they're not yet guilty of any of the things that they're accused of. I mean, the label fascist, for example. You can abuse them on 100 counts, but fascism and BJP, I mean, where has it carried out mass murders or whatever? How do they target, for example, BJP and Modi in this very determined and nasty manner? What have they got against?
It's rooted in the philosophy of the RSS. Obviously, the RSS is extremely unpalatable to the liberal West, especially to the Wokes, because the RSS upholds a system of values rooted in Indian culture and tradition, and it is seen as the archetypical conservative organization, paramilitary in its system, and hierarchical, and therefore opposed to revolution and subversion. So that makes the RSS
PFI,
an enemy.
they love PFI and they hate RSS. RSS is a very mild version of, I mean, you said militarized, but they're not weapon trained. At best,
No,
they carry that little lathi. But PFI is a weaponized fascist organization. They seem to have no problem with that.
of course not. I mean, really, they have no problem with terrorism as long as terrorism is essentially breaking up traditional societies in its own way. On the other hand, what they fear about RSS is the doctrine, is the thought. Remember,
What
they are
is
not
that?
so afraid of weapons. They are afraid of the thinking, of the doctrine which is being propagated. And there is no question that Prime Minister Modi is a product, is a pupil of the RSS. So are many people in the government. And therefore, the BJP has earned the Wokes' suspicion and hatred in many cases. So they targeted them as fascist from the beginning. And you know that there was a certain degree of, I wouldn't say fraternization, but sympathy between Trump and Modi,
Yeah.
just as it was between the BJP and the GOP, which is still in some ways there, not among the so-called rhinos, Republicans in name only. These are all purely establishment figures. But the Trumpians, the new Republicans, have, like all nationalists, they have no ill will towards the BJP. They may not know about them. Most of them think they're probably Buddhist, because most Americans have not realized that India is Hindu even now. But the fact is that they have no particular gripe with them. They are quite willing to talk to them and even make them friends, especially if they need to oppose China. On the other hand, the Democrats, who are generally controlled by the ultra-liberal lobby, they definitely hated and hate the BJP, and they are imposing now increasing sanctions against India. You see, they have now gone all the way to calling Azad Kashmir, they call it Azad Jammu and Kashmir, not POK. They are restoring the relationship with the ISI, sorry, not SI, ISI. They are providing money for the Pakistani army. They are making all sorts of wins to Pakistan while putting India essentially on the blacklist. And this is very clearly due to the fact that India has not gone along with them on Russia with regard to Ukraine. And that for them is anathema, because it implies that India, Russia, and even China eventually could be together, at least on certain issues, which is basically opposing and replacing Western hegemony, which is another great goal of the liberal woke power holders. You know, they certainly want to keep control over the world, and anybody who challenges them is going to be targeted and attacked and eventually destroyed if they can get away with it.
You know, switching gears, um, hitherto, all those people who wanted to control the world conquerors, so to speak, always thought of passing on this power and wealth they accumulated to their children, creating dynasties, be it the Mughal dynasty or the Nehru dynasty or any other, anywhere else in the world. You wanted to pass on a certain legacy, and that the holders of that legacy were invariably your own family. Now, in this case, the Wokes don't believe in family. Most of them don't even want to have children. LGBT, whatever else, they're certainly not the most reproductive people in the world, because same sex people, I mean, can't be producing children, at least as of now. So, till they shift reproduction into labs, and then they have these designer babies come out in whatever shade, color, and size they want. Till then, they have nothing. Who will they pass on the world to? So, this power mongering and desire to control the world, including wanting 10% of the population and wanting the rest of the 90% to just disappear, if if they won't do it willingly, then to decimate them through all kinds of technological means. So, no bloodshed, but they will invent vaccines, they will invent all kinds of things so that they disappear. The point that I'm trying to make is this: none of these people, be it the open society devil, um, what's his name? Why am I forgetting him?
You mean Karl Popper
No, no,
or
no, no, no.
George
No, no, he
Soros?
was a good man. Karl Popper, no.
No, no, he
The
was,
guy,
of course, he was a theoretician, yeah. But I mean, but open society, are you referring to George Soros then?
Soros, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
They haven't yet found a way to be immortal. Secondly, this decimation of all institutions, especially family, sense of community, religion, dharma, anything, tradition, culture, what are they going to be left with? And who do they pass it on to? These deracinated individuals who are completely rootless, where are they going to plant these people? And what are these people going to do? I mean, the world doesn't make sense. It has to have certain logic. Either they should have by now found a formula to be immortal. So they'll be in control forever. That makes sense. Okay, we want a less populated world. About 2, 3 years ago, one of my nephews started talking this language, that he wanted X percentage of people vanish, all in the name of environmentalism,
Right,
equality.
right.
And he, I knew him as a very young, idealistic um, person who was full of good intentions, wanted to do good to the world. And suddenly, when I heard from him this, I thought it was his own fantasy, and I got worried. In fact, I thought he needs therapy. Why is he thinking like that? I thought it was something that he thought it up, because in India, when you move around, whether you want to travel by metro or you are out on the street, you feel the pressure of overpopulation. They're
Right.
constantly rubbing shoulders with people. Body integrity is not protected when there's so much pressure on land. So I thought that this young person, very idealistic, has come up with a rather bizarre idea. Till I found out that some of the smartest brains, or those considered some of the smartest cutting edge brains in the world, have actually created a whole ideology out of it. And this is more noxious than the class war ideology or the class war formula given by Marx, which created, again, genocide after genocide. Wherever Marxism planted itself firmly, it led to massive genocides. Now they're doing it in the name of liberalism. They're doing it in the name of individualism. But what's left of the individual form? Um, what ground does this individual stand on? Or is it a robot, a
Well,
robotic
first,
individual?
you cannot assume that the people who head or fund, promote such ideas necessarily apply them to themselves. I mean, you have quoted George Soros. He has had a family, he has children, his sons are very powerfully placed. I'm not even sure how many children he has, but his son is one of the leading billionaires in New York City. So clearly, they don't see succession being necessarily denied to them personally. They may not think the same about the vast masses of humanity. Second, when you talk about the idea of reducing the population, it's a very old one. It has roots in eugenism. It was embraced by the Nazis since they felt that the lordly race, the pure race, the Aryans had to reproduce in large numbers, but the inferior races had to be wiped out because they essentially used land that could have been much better used by the Aryans. By the way, this was not so far from the ideas of some of the colonizers who felt, there are hardly any really useful people in Africa. We can take the land and make it really productive with our technologies. And where do these people go? Well, look at what the Americans did with the natives, with the Indians, so-called Indians. They basically kicked them out and pushed them out and tried to kill as many as possible because they wanted the land. So you see, this is very much part of the human, unfortunately, the human instinct.
Yeah, you're right. Western culture and Abrahamics are essentially predatory. And
That is true.
predatory ideologies are, are morphing into newer and newer sicknesses. They don't stop. It's
Yeah,
not as if,
certainly. There are many forms of social Darwinism, and they certainly have an effect on the realities we are living in. The fact is that if you look at even China, with its one-child policy, China completely embraced that idea that you have to reduce your population by hook and by crook. And of course, now they realize that they have a serious problem because they are aging too fast. And who is going to work to support all those aging people? In America, I have interviewed a friend, Catherine Austin Fitz, who was the head of the Housing and Urban Development Department under Ronald Reagan. She was undersecretary. And she told me bluntly on that interview, on that podcast, that the US had decided 30 years ago that the population was growing too much on the one hand, and on the other hand, people were living too old, which was bankrupting the insurance and social security systems. So they decided there were to be means adopted to reduce life expectancy. And they did. I mean, Americans are dying younger now than they did 20 years ago.
yeah.
So you see, some policies are adopted even though they are not visible, but they are there in whatever means you can, whatever way you can analyze them. You will find that they have very conveniently adopted policies in the name of public health, security, etc., which all sounds very good. But in the end, what you get is people getting sick, getting obese, and dying younger. So you can see that these policies have been at work. And now we are, of course, coming to a sort of a head because we're realizing that there are just too many people, and what is going to happen to our planet, and especially in Asia, Africa. So naturally, the people who live in less populated countries where the population is actually diminishing, They are actually shrinking. So they are very worried, what will we do when we are just a few and we have these huge masses that come into our land because they don't have enough resources to live in their own lands. So that is where you get the thought of somehow we must do something about it. And of course, they won't say so in so many words, but you can imagine that some thinking is going on, especially in military scientific circles.
True. Very true. My last question to you before we take, if there are any questions. You know, one of the, I mean, there's been talk of clash of civilizations, mostly in the context of Islam and Christianity. Though I honestly don't see much of a clash. I see them as twin brothers or first cousins at least. The real clash is I think with the Indic faith traditions or Indic cultures. And here, what strikes me is that the entire Abrahamic world is based on a certain contempt for the past, not Islam, but certainly the Christian world, whereas the people hitherto existing on the surface of this earth were all far behind us. We are the smartest. And there's this theory of linear progression. So you move from Stone Age to Copper Age to this age to that age to Industrial Revolution and so on and so forth. And today's world order is seen as a certain acme. So it's as though natural linear progression. That's how society moves. Whereas in the Hindu worldview, uh, our past was is seen as so much more glorious and worth emulation than anything available in today's world. So the concept of Ram Rajya still carries a deep emotional resonance. And we think that ruler rule relationship couldn't have been better anywhere in the world, in the manner in which not just Ram, but so many other, or Yudhishthir, or even as recent as Ahilyabai Holkar, who followed very traditional norms of governance, or the dynasty in Kerala, uh, you know,
Yes,
the
Travancore.
ruling, yes, the Travancore, Mysore.
Mysore family also, the Mysore Maharajas.
That's right, the Mysore Maharajas, the Kolhapur Maharaja, so many of them. I mean, the British demonized them all, but the fact is that these were far better governed societies because they took their notion of their role as rulers from, from the classical texts, from the Ramayana, from Mahabharata, from Manusmriti, from a whole range of Shastric or Dharmic texts. But the West is so hostile, and the fact that we Indians or Hindus cling to it. Islamists cling to their past because again they're not allowed. There, the punishment for wanting even one small change in the message that came to them 1400 years ago is death. So they dare not change, comma, or full stop. But and therefore they have to cling to it through force of just sheer brute violence. But Hindus have no such fear of disowning. You can disown your Shastras, you can be an atheist, nobody's going to come kill you for that. But yet we stay connected, and that connection is not going. And therefore, I feel the West really hates us with subliminal fury as to why we refuse to be modernized, become good and sound Macaulay Putras. I mean, Macaulay tried and succeeded very ably in a manner, but succeeded in the sense of producing today a whole mass producing deracinated Hindus. But those who retain even a touch of their traditional value system stay connected to the past far more than or they conceive of a future more in terms of uh, the ideal set forth by the past. Don't you think in this notion of our notion being cyclical, which is
Yes.
um, it's not linear. We are not at the acme of
Mm.
progress. On the contrary, we see today this age as Kali Yuga, the age of uh, you know of evil as the
Yeah.
dominant
Right.
force. So
Adharma. Yeah, that's the whole thing.
Adharma,
Adharma.
that's right.
Mm.
So this clash of civilization, is there ever going to be a meeting ground?
Well, the fact is that the West is also facing a very fierce internal conflict now because a lot of people are rising against what they perceive increasingly as a monumental failure of Western modern civilization in spite of its stupendous technological achievements. You know, what we call progress, which is again a favorite word of the left, particularly the wokes, you know, progressive thought, which is that you have to
Yeah,
have LGBTs everywhere because that's progressive. Otherwise, you are regressive and you are whatever homophobic or immediately they call it phobic as soon as you don't embrace these ideas, ideology. I mean, again, on a political level. So the question is, yes, there is a conflict between India and the West, and of course, India is rather isolated against many forces. You talked about Macaulay, but the fact is that, as we all know, there are lots of Indians who have very gladly converted to the even to the woke ethics, or if you call it an
yes.
ethics, woke philosophy, and who are living either in America or in India or in the West and in Europe, and who are ardently supporting the penetration of woke ideas in India. Some of them sincerely thinking that it's all for good, and others with ulterior motives. But the fact is that the West is, in my view, and I'm not alone in this, on the brink of collapse. And maybe in some way, perversely, the wokes are also welcoming that because they realize that the only thing that they can eventually achieve is destruction. But if you look at the state of the major economies in the West, if you look at the condition of the banks, of the major corporations, of the households, you realize that the level of debt based on the creation of funny money or funny money, which doesn't exist, is going to precipitate a huge crash, which will be as bad or worse than the 1929 crash. And that depression will force a complete re engineering or reconstruction of all the institutions that are now ruling the roost. United Nations, World Bank, IMF, you name them, all these big NGOs. It's all going for a toss in the next few years.
That
So,
even
that,
I'll celebrate.
sorry.
I'm not a woke, but I'll certainly celebrate the death of these
Well, there is,
devilish
you know,
institutions.
when a system is beyond repair, you have to expect it to collapse. Not you're going to destroy it yourself, but you
Yeah.
basically know it's going to collapse, and you just have to accept it. There is no point, as they say, crying over spilled milk. So the fact is that we are going in that direction. It's going to happen, and we have some of us have been predicting it for the last 20 years or more. Beginning with 2001, you know, we could see that things were really taking a turn for the worse very quickly. So now we are at the real breaking point, and that, in my view and in the view of many, will give India and other civilizations that have retained a connection with their past to restore a healthier, more natural, and more sustainable world order. Because many of the leaders of this current so-called woke revolution are going to collapse and will not be able to impose their will on others.
Well, that's good news. That's very good news. And I just hope that they don't all come, or the British, for example, don't come seeking asylum in India when Taliban and ISIS take over Britain. That's my dread. They're inviting it, and I hope they stay and face the music there instead of seeking asylum here, because India has been the most favorite asylum place for all persecuted people of the world. No more. No more is my thought, my first and foremost thought. Anyway, let's see. There are a lot of interesting comments all through while you were talking. And if there are, if there are any, no, I don't think there are any super chats, but I'll just bring a few comments on the admin. Can you please bring explore Edwin? He has been making, whoever he is or she, making interesting comments. Can you bring some of these comments? Also, friends, I want to apologize for the delay, but it's because Com had problems with his camera. If the camera worked, the sound didn't work. If the sound worked, the camera stopped, and so on and so forth. So, but we finally managed it. At one point, it seemed to me as though we might have to just cancel it, but we managed. So he says, enemy of the enemy has some goal to destroy society and take over the world is supremely good. When you can also bed them and become their slaves in the harem, with steady supply of worker bees. Oh my God, this is. There are two, three others. Just bring another one also. This one my head is left reeling. Communism plus Allah is Islam, and Islam minus Allah is communism, and feminism is Marxism of family. You want to comment on this?
It's hard to make comments because it would take a long time. I think
Yeah.
nuances are everything. We must be careful about not making blanket statements. Um, are there elements common to certain ideologies and religions? Certainly there are. Still, they are very different in their application, and because they were created in very different environments and in very different times. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't be able to say anything I would very meaningful unless I go on another talk, which is which
Okay, which is not
more
possible.
time. Yeah.
But I think a lot of people have commented that wokes are partners of jihadi terrorists, which I think on the whole you agree with. That by and large, especially in the context of India, you see them on the side of jihadi terrorists.
Well, in the West too, they are generally very muted in their criticism. They favor what they call these sort of peaceful reactions, which are not necessarily very helpful, and they take a much harder line with what they call the far right. I mean, it's very interesting in countries like France, England, Germany. If you are far right, then you are guilty of all sorts of crimes, even if you have never had, made any
But
kind
there's
of.
no right left here. Modi is more left than any left. If left
No, no, but,
means,
it doesn't
being
matter how you define yourself. Once they have defined you as far right, that's the way it is. I'll
that's
give
it.
you the example of the National Rally in France, which is what could have been called a right-wing party with a strong social agenda 40 years ago. They would not have been out of place with De Gaulle. He pretty much believed in similar things. But now they have become far right, and they'll be far right forever. As much as they may want to say, listen, we have more social ideas than many of you people, they will still be told, no, no, you are far right because you hate people or whatever. They once they make these categories, you cannot
Yeah.
get out. It's like the same as applied, by the way, to RSS. Even if they never take any violent action, they are still violent because that's the way they are and that's the way we want them to be. So there is no
True.
reason there.
There's another comment which says, on the topic of wokism and genocidal tendency, I have one psychological disorder to add. Having heard recently in Dr. Jordan Peterson's interview with Piers Morgan, narcissistic compassion. Does it ring a bell?
Very much so. Absolutely. In fact, Jordan Peterson has said many of the things that we were talking about, and he has said it in a very convincing, persuasive way. And that's probably why he's seen as a sort of a, pariah in most fashionable intellectual circles, because he challenges these sort of doctrines that are being propagated with the support of governments in the West.
True. Okay, unless there's something particularly exciting, there's what's this? 2,000 years ago, meek shall inherit the earth. The problem is, rightists and traditionalists don't realize that resentment is underlying tool used by left ecosystem.
Yes, I mean, I have no particular comments about that. I'm not sure what exactly he
What he means is the meek, the Christian world was supposed to live by this adage: the meek shall
yes,
inherit the earth.
yes,
And it's turned this wisdom or promise on its head. And today, the corporates that are controlling the world, or the mafia that is controlling the world, is neither meek nor particularly Christian minded. That's what I think he means.
yes, certainly. Listen, again, I think that the conclusion we should bring to bear is that we certainly are not phobic against any particular person or community that has certain attitudes to life or certain habits which may or may not be healthy and natural. This is not the issue. We are basically facing a political agenda which is totalitarian and hegemonic. And that's what we are opposed to. We are not trying to cast certain people into some sort of a, hell because we don't like the way they live. I mean, that's not our attitude. Our attitude is simply to warn of the danger of subverting society by following totally irrational and destructive ideologies. We have seen that under Marxism in the Soviet Union and China, and we see it again now in a different form in many societies. And in fact, all societies are attacked to various extents by that. So there is no question that power has its own imperative. Once any organization comes to power, it cannot be meek, because by definition, power is a form of imposition, even if it is done with a great deal of consent. So that we have to agree. Realistically, if you read Saint Augustine, who was only 5 centuries after Christ, he was already saying that, I believe in Christianity because I see how powerful the church is. So we were no longer talking only about the message of Christ. We were talking about an organization which had the power to submit a lot of people, if not all, to its will. And that is what made it hegemonic.
True, true. My last comment from you. Where in the world do you see hope? Which part of the world do you see acting more sanely as against the woke dominated world?
I see a reawakening in countries in the West where people who are rejecting this ideological tyranny are rising in various ways, in various forms, whether it's in Hungary, in Italy, in France, in Spain, you name all those countries, in the US in its own way too.
Poland?
Sorry?
Poland.
Yes, well, Poland unfortunately has got its own baggage of, very antagonistic nationalism with the nostalgia for past greatness and trying to fight all its neighbors, and that's not going anywhere, I'm afraid. But beyond that, I think that there are indeed some very positive movements emerging. Any action generates a reaction, so the reaction eventually takes place. I think that the coalition of countries that's coming together in the format of BRICS and SCO is very positive because it poses a challenge to the hegemonic West through the dollar hegemony, and it essentially builds an alternative model. Now, the alternative model has problems, it's not well defined, but we can see it express itself in the decision to form an alternative currency which will be based on real value, not on printing electronic IOUs in New York. So that will be a very positive change because it will reorient the world towards real values and real value. And I think that's very hopeful for the future, even though many people are, of course, aghast at anything which involves China in a leading role. But, sometimes, as they say, God acts in mysterious ways. Certain forces are generated which at a given time play a positive role by preventing another force from taking over completely.
True. And to my mind, one of the most deadly symbols of this globalized woke economy is the credit card. And now this new form of currency. It just takes away all power, you don't control your resources anymore. And they can be confiscated, they can be blocked anytime, in the way, for example, the West did with even Russia's money lying in its banks. It just refused to release money that belonged to Russia. So these
So the
banks
question,
and
exactly what they call central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are eventually, somebody gave that analogy, like credit at the company store. Basically, you are given credit as long as they like you, but then if they don't like something, they stop you and
yeah,
say, I don't know, you have done something there that we don't approve of. I mean, Israel was, in a way, a test tube for this, because they started following people around with their cell phones. And if people met somebody who was positive with regard to COVID, then they want this person on the phone, please go back home immediately and don't get out, because you have been in touch with somebody who is tested positive, therefore you are not supposed to get out. This is the way that technically the financial system could operate. You have been
yeah,
in touch with unsavory people who are involved in criminal activities, therefore we are canceling your accounts and you are no longer able to use your money.
yeah,
And
that's right.
unfortunately, this is what we are getting. Now, China is experimenting with that, and the West is following very avidly. In fact, the West may get there even before China, some countries at least.
So, people in India, you better watch out. Keep your assets in a form that they are under your control. Like traditional Indian housewives used to keep it in the form of gold. Um, Now, I don't know if that's still prevalent, or people are doing other things. But your money should be under your own control. Don't trust any government with all your assets, because the governments are themselves being managed by mysterious forces who are certainly not trustworthy. So, anyway, thank you, Com. Thank you for a very stimulating talk. And you took us far and wide, back and forth in history and the big geographic spread. I hope, viewers, you enjoyed all that you heard, the insights that Com shared with us. So, please do share this video with others, and keep, what is it? What are they supposed to do? Like, share, subscribe. I'm supposed to always remind them to do that. And now, several of our viewers also tell me that I keep forgetting that in the middle of the program, at the start of the program, I should remind viewers, please like, share, and subscribe, ring the bell icon, वगैरह वगैरह. तो प्लीज कर दिया कीजिए, आप खुद ही कर दिया कीजिए, मुझे याद नहीं रहता ये बात बोलना. तो इन्हीं शब्दों के साथ आई टेक योर लीव. वंदे मातरम. शुभ रात्रि.
Jai Hind, Namaskar.
जय हिंद.
Madhu.
नमस्कार.
Thank
थैंक
you.
यू.